Hello, everyone, and welcome to Jaynky to the Max, a podcast where we talk about fascinating projects and the interesting creators who create them. Today on the show, we have Patrick, who is a co-founder of CareWeather, which is a startup that uses small satellites to take in weather data. Before we get to that, a few things. First off, if you are listening on Spotify or Pocket Cast, we just live stream all these episodes in the Jaynky DIY server, so make sure to join that. An important event that's coming up as well is Jamcraft, which is hosted by Jack. It's going to be a 10-day game jam from April 10th to April 20th. It's going to be a lot of fun. There's going to be a lot of people that are going to be involved in it. So if you're into that thing, definitely sign up. And with me, last but definitely not least, is my fantastic co-host, Glavin.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show.
Welcome, Patrick, to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's to be fun.
Yeah. So tell us what you do. Tell us about your startup.
Yeah, so we're building small satellites to measure wind over the ocean more frequently than it's currently measured. Currently, scientists rely on mappings of winds that are refreshed about twice a day. And we're working towards the National Science Foundation or the National Academy of Sciences goals to refresh wind measurements every hour.
Wow, that's impressive. What kind of what benefit is there from having data refreshed that quickly versus what it is currently?
There's a lot of processes that scientists can't observe in anywhere close enough to real time to model them. So the really classic example is hurricanes, right? As you can imagine, they change a lot faster than a couple times a day.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, our ability to model how those hurricanes work, how they change over time, is pretty limited because we can't observe it.
Oh,
amazing.
Cool. So where are you at now in the whole process? Have you launched some satellites? You have some orbiting? Or are you in kind of the beginnings of it, raising capital in between?
Yeah, we're pretty early stage. We worked on a satellite project before at the university where me and my teammate met, and it's also the university we're partnering with. And we've been working on taking lessons from that and trying to make our underlying satellite platform a lot better, so that it support the radar that we need to measure wind. Okay, and we're also working on raising, but that's sort of a secondary. It's not a top priority right now,
right?
Just because, as long as we're not doing anything crazy in terms of costs, we're able to get pretty far on a small amount of capital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because your biggest overhead will be launching the satellites and the actual parts, right?
Yeah, and so obviously satellite launch is really expensive. Mm-hmm. So we've been thinking a lot lately about how do we approximate approximate operation in space through really cheap testing as best we can. So we've come up with a lot of good ideas there.
Yeah, a lot on the last episode we talked to Applied Ion, who is I'm sure you know of him. He was telling us about some of the crazy expenses for just basic small sat parts. So how are you dealing with that? Is there a way you model it, simulate the satellite before you actually getting parts in hand and assembling it, or do you actually just have to get the parts and be like, oh, rip, I just blew a $10,000 circuit board? What's your approach?
So there's a spectrum of approaches here, and they really have to do with your intended volume. So if you're planning on a larger constellation of satellites, you're flying in a lower orbit, you can get away with lower costs. So Planet has demonstrated this really well. Are you familiar with Planet?
Just give a brief description for that.
Yeah. So Planet is a venture-funded satellite company that does optical visual imaging, and they set out 6 or 7 years ago with the mission to basically create a Google Maps image of the entire Earth every day. so that you could track changes of all kinds of things.
Whoa!
And
Wow.
So it takes about I don't know the exact number. It's like 100 to 200 satellites to do that, and they're all 3U CubeSats, so shoebox sized. And to keep costs down, they decided to opt for system-wide reliability across the constellation, sort of network reliability, instead of reliability in an individual satellite. And they've done really well with that. It turns out that, a lot of the heritage decisions, this is my opinion, a lot of the heritage decisions that we've made when it comes to what's best practice for space engineering were made a long time ago, and they're sort of made on like single case studies of failure. And when you have a little bit more volume, you can sort of actually study what is higher risk and how to make what are reasonable trade-offs for reliability across the constellation. So generally, there's not really a strong reason to design in a way or to use parts that are extremely expensive.
Okay.
So you talk about what. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh no. So your goal is to have just like a lot of them, and that way, if one fails or something, it's not a big deal because you can easily replace it instead of having to have just a few modules that are really expensive.
Yeah, and eventually you want to move into more reliability, but if you're planning on iterating one satellite after another and you're doing it in a low enough orbit that you're not creating debris, then yeah, so if you're planning on iterating, then you can work up to that reliability that you would get with really expensive parts off the bat, using parts that are a lot cheaper.
Mm-hmm. So I take it do you have any like thrusters on board, like ion cannons and such, which like we were talking about last episode, or since you're not going to really worry about, at least that's not a priority, you're just going to forget that?
Yeah, we're really interested in how do we iterate as quickly as possible and continue to iterate to improve our system. We have this initial target of measuring wind, but I think there's a lot of other parameters that we could measure that we could potentially integrate in the same satellite. So I sort of see the natural deorbit that happens to satellite as just a opportunity for doing end of life on older revisions and launching something that's improved.
Planned obsolescence.
Yeah. Yep. But nature.
That's really cool.
Maybe ways to use thrusters eventually, especially the stuff. I think his name's Michael at Applied Ion.
Yeah, I don't know.
And guy, I think the stuff he's doing is awesome because we never would have considered thrusters before, but he's bringing it down to the cost range where we really could, and that may allow us to be more responsible in the sense that we could maneuver if there was a potential collision. All of it. But right now, like if we have a low enough orbit, our life's low enough, and our size makes it so the risk of collision is also extremely low. So
that's really cool. So how far are you away from like a launch date, do you think?
If we had money, this is where that discussion about like how do we test on the ground. If we had raised already, we would have something that's ready to fly really soon here. Goal has been to just iterate, to get to the point where we're iterating on the entire satellite as quickly as possible, preferably like close to weekly. And so like we've been using, I don't know if you're familiar with JLC PCB's SMT assembly service.
No, I am not.
But electronics, it's fantastic. They have a lineup of like, this is a factory in Shenzhen, China. They have a lineup of like 40 pick and place machines, all stocked with a set of base components. And so if you use those components, then they will put them on your circuit board basically for free.
Wow.
And so you can get assembled circuit, like we'll get a CD sized or a phone sized circuit board, and like a set of 5 assembled circuit boards for like $50. and we get them back in a week from when we sent them out. So there's some trade-offs you have to take, like we said, trade-offs with cost and sort of with the rest of the system, but we're able to iterate really quickly because of that.
Mm-hmm. And that's the lean model, right? Iteration over quality. No, not quality, but like iteration over spending just a lot of resources on one thing.
The trade-off is you can get reliability through lots of extra simulation and testing of the components of the system, or you can get reliability by trying things out in an integrated system and testing them all together.
Mm-hmm. I just love the fact that we're like able to use the common maxim in Silicon Valley of failing faster, and we can apply that to space. Like I think that's just incredible that we're at that point where we don't have to worry about, because I mean when you send something to back in the day, when you sent a satellite up, that was a huge deal and cost millions of dollars, and you can't iterate that, but now we can, and I think that's so encouraging.
We're getting there, yeah. And I feel like we're just on the cusp, especially with hardware. We're like, the tools are getting better, but they're still a long way off from where software tooling is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So my brother is a full cycle engineer. Both of my brothers are full cycle engineers at their startup, and so I'm always envious of them because they're creating and deploying new iterations on their system, like multiple times a day, if not multiple times an hour. So
yeah, you can't do that quite yet, but it's a lot better.
Yeah, but if we could do something like that weekly, that would be phenomenal.
Oh yeah. And Glavin, you had hit us with one of those questions you had.
All right. So you mentioned earlier about how the current satellite tech for monitoring weather patterns is only refreshed twice a day. What is specifically limiting the current technology to that 2 times a day limit? Is it just the number of satellites that are able to go over a specific patch each day, or is it something, just the amount of processing required?
It's the number of satellites. If you think about it, to stay in orbit, satellites have to be going really fast, right?
Mm-hmm.
So they can't really hover, unless they're in geostationary orbit, they can't really hover over any given area. And so to get more frequent measurement, you really just need more satellites.
That makes sense. And then what's some of the highlights that you've had with... like a lot of this stuff really requires a lot of capital to get things moving and get things rolling. What's some of the highlights you've had with trying to get an investor involved in these space companies?
So we're just barely making our foray into that. I talked to Utah investors a little bit. So Utah's where I'm located. Mm-hmm. And the sense I got was that Utah's kind of not ready to invest in something ambitious like space. So, but we have found we've made some friends in the LA area where it sounds like there's quite a big community of space and hardware investment. So for us, so the best advice I've heard on when to raise or when to focus on raising is to wait as long as you possibly can. Mm-hmm. And we participated in some competitions at BYU, and we've gotten a little bit of capital there. And like I mentioned, our prototyping process is super cheap. So our goal right now is just to continue to develop the technology as much as we can with the funding that we have.
Yeah, that's smart. I definitely agree with bootstrapping as much as you can, so you can helps you work out the kinks early on instead of waiting.
For sure.
Now, the one catch with that is, like I said, I think testing at the system level is super powerful, especially if you want to iterate. And the best place to do that is in space. So that was why we had started looking into investment. and we're sort of doing it on the side a little bit right now, but it's not our main focus. But yeah. So we really wanted to raise so we could start launching, but I think there may be ways that we can do really good testing without raising capital, and if that lets us sort of continue to form our company in the ways that we want to without outside pressures, I think there's some value to that.
So it sounds like you have a little bit of difficulty with like just getting people on board with this. What's something that you would like to be able to change or advocate in the public perception of space companies?
Can you rephrase that?
So basically, like
just
something that you'd like to be able to change or advocate in the public perception of space companies. So like you kind of mentioned how it seemed to be really difficult to get funding. Like Utah doesn't seem like it was really ready just yet. Is that something that you'd like to change, and how would you? What kind of how would you like to be able to change that public perception of the ambition of going to space versus what we have right now, of more people kind of focused on Earth?
Yeah. So you mean public, not investor, just in general?
Just in general, yeah.
A really broad question. I think generally I'd say that anytime we're exploring the unknown, right, we're going to find the things that we didn't know, we don't know, that could be really beneficial to us, right? I think we're experiencing this globally right now. How badly do we all wish we had been more prepared for pandemics, right?
Right.
We all wish that every government in the world had invested far more in epidemiological research. So, yeah, I mean, I think there's two sides of this. There's the enterprise side, and then there's the science side. When it comes to space exploration and like government-funded space exploration, where the government is doing it itself, I think in large part it's best if they stick to the science side, and then incentivize enterprise to sort of provide the supporting infrastructure. And I think it's trending in that direction a lot. It's been a long time coming.
Yeah, that's a really good goal to have. I like to be able to see that continue to go, like especially with just a lot of more companies getting involved outside of just government. Like I've seen like SpaceX launching satellites to the ISS, which is really cool. I'd really like to be able to see that, seeing a private company be able to do that instead of just only a government company. I thought that was pretty neat.
Well, and since if you encourage private enterprise, that means that they'll be a lot more resourceful and a lot less wasteful, because it's their bottom dollar.
It's there to make money.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, so you're just going to have more optimized systems, which is good news for everyone.
And it gets more people involved with actually trying to get to space.
Yes.
Yeah, that's true too. Yeah, and unfortunately, we still sort of see fights with this. There are people who fight for like the Artemis program to go the single source contractor route.
Wait, what is the Artemis program?
It's NASA's current effort to re-land a person on the moon. So, current presidential administration's pushing for them to land someone on the moon by 2024. Anyway, there are some very large U.S. aerospace companies that would really like all of that money to go to them. And so they're pushing for it to be sort of single-sourced, traditional contracting. But one of the reasons we have such a renaissance in commercial space is due to some programs that NASA ran that incentivized commercial companies.
Oh, interesting.
The commercial cargo program and commercial crew programs were and are huge in how much they've helped SpaceX grow. In fact, I don't know this for sure, but I think it's possible that SpaceX wouldn't have survived, or definitely wouldn't be as strong as it is today without that partnership, without that incentives and support from NASA. So, in general, space is hard in some sense, but there are really smart ways to explore it. There are cost-effective ways, and I think it's getting to the point where anyone can take part.
Right.
If you've heard of KickSat, that's sort of the quintessential way for anyone to take part in sort of spacecraft themselves, because you have this.
KickSat, to tell us more. That sounds good.
Yeah, so KickSat is a project run by Zach Manchester. He's now a professor at Stanford, and he had support from NASA as he was doing this. But they took a 3U CubeSat, so shoebox size, and they filled it with like 100 little stamp-sized satellites. And they ran a Kickstarter, so anyone could sort of buy their own little satellite for like $1,000, and it would get flown into space with KickSat, and then it would get a communication link. I can't remember what they ended up doing. Eventually, they tossed around a few different ideas, whether it was a communication link to the 3U CubeSat, or whether they were able to get communications from the individual stamp-sized satellites to the ground. But either way, they launched it last year and successfully talked to these little satellites. So
whoa,
it's to the point where, with a little bit of cash, anyone could really fly something in space and explore space.
Yeah,
and that's
with launch costs. I heard some estimate like lowest is like 40,000 or something. Which I mean, admittedly, that's a lot of money, but like again, that's
cheap.
Not like millions of dollars.
I think SpaceX is 2,000 per kilogram.
Really?
So at their bulk launch cost. So if you could divide that up really efficiently, and you had like a 10-gram satellite or something, the costs are getting really low once you do that. Yeah,
that's crazy low.
Yeah,
wow. Sure. That just makes me so happy right now. I'm glad, with the pandemic, I was a little bit concerned about Space Month, but I'm glad we're going ahead with it, because I think it just gives us so much like hope and positivity, that things might be bad, but there's also a lot of good and a lot of great things to be happy about, specifically in space.
Yeah, and space has brought us a lot of benefits that we wouldn't have expected without it, and I think there's a lot of potential for it to continue to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And biased, because that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. No, I can get as many players on the field as we can, and it makes everyone much better.
Exactly. Yeah, it's kind of one of the big things I always advocate is like the more people that you have that are have not only, because education isn't the only thing that goes into if you're able to do something. It's being able to have access to the means to be able to carry out experimentation, to be able to get these CubeSats out into space. Even if it's just a small thing the size of a stamp, it gets your foot in the door to be able to understand what you're going to be dealing with. So that way it's not just an unknown, it's something that you can now have experience with, and in a cost-effective way that everyone can afford.
In fact, there's CubeSats, which are the shoebox or tissue box size satellites, and then there's anywhere from that to the stamp satellites that I mentioned. There's also something in between called a pocket cube, which is about fist-sized. Mm-hmm. So anyway, we were planning on doing our initial iterations in CubeSats, and then we started learning more about pocket cubes and realized there really wasn't a strong reason that we needed the entire CubeSat to do our, to test the early versions of the system. So then we started looking into pocket cubes. That the trick right now is the number of launches for pocket cubes is still ramping up. There's only really about one per year.
Really? So, that low?
Yeah. Well, pocket cubes, I mean, before last year, only 4 had flown ever.
Oh.
So, really new standard. And now I think the number's up to 10 to 15, somewhere around there. And so, it's ramping up. There's really just one supplier, Alba Orbital, that's launching them, and they're doing a great job.
Interesting.
So,
and tell us a little more about. We got a question from our listeners, but just tell us more about like how are they deployed? So you have these small sats, and they're in the rocket and the payload. Do they just fly out there, or is there like special deploying mechanisms? Like what's involved in to get these things in orbit?
So it depends on where they're being launched from. But all cubes, the thing that's valuable about the standard is typically you can also standardize the dispenser that releases the satellites. So CubeSats have this standard dispenser that is either called a P-pod or just a CubeSat dispenser. That's a little bit like a Pez dispenser. So it's got a spring. It's this rectangular tube, and it's got a spring in the back that pushes the CubeSats out the tube when the door opens at the other end.
Oh.
So, it's not a super complicated system, but a lot more launch vehicles are providing it. There are other ways to release CubeSats and other satellites, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
SpaceX is doing really interesting stuff with having no deployer at all, which I think
they
is
just
fantastic.
go in there and they just release to free roam satellites.
I mean, they just stack up 60 of these things and then they just let them spin off of the launch vehicle.
Huh.
And I guess they make them rugged enough that if they bump into each other, they're fine. If you haven't looked up a Starlink satellite deployment, you've got to look them up. It's crazy. Just have 60 of these things coming off of the Falcon 9.
It's like little babies. It's coming out.
Another fun one to see is the India PSLV launch that Planet did, where they launched like 90 of their shoebox-sized satellites, all from the same rocket.
Oh.
And that one, it's just like a pea shooter, just one after another, just this constant string of satellites coming out forever.
Wow.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, I was kind of figuring that when they launch these things, it kind of has to have some sort of a strategy to get them deployed so they're not bumping into each other. And I'm not sure how complex these satellites, these CubeSats, get if they have deployable, say, solar panels that come out or anything like that might make them more vulnerable to being bumped around.
Yeah, and that's where I was mentioning with SpaceX. It seems that they don't have some structure that's deploying them separately. For SpaceX, they seem to be just deploying them as a cluster, and it seems like they've made them rugged enough to withstand bumping into each other. Other CubeSats and other satellites, that's definitely true. They try and do very controlled release so that nothing's bumping into anything else.
Now, is that just like a service that someone that's wanting to be able to launch satellites up, that's something that they would consider as far as being able to choose a deployment company? Is like, okay, this one here is cheaper because they just deploy it in mass, but we have a little bit more delicate system. It needs to be deployed in a very specific manner. Is that something that's going to come into play, you think, in satellite launching companies?
So right now, the standard is for everything to be deployed in a very delicate way.
Mm-hmm.
So I think it would be great if a launch provider or a broker essentially provided alternatives where it was cheaper because they didn't have the mass and volume taken up by the dispenser. But I don't know of anyone that's really providing that. It's pretty novel that SpaceX is doing it. But there are a lot of different launch companies. And if you want to put a satellite up, like one of these CubeSats, you either talk to the launch company itself, some broker their satellites directly, or there's a lot of companies that all they do is they're sort of the middleman. They help you find a launch provider to fly.
All right. Now, with us ramping up how many trips we're making to space to launch these small satellites, does there start to become a point where there's increased risk of these satellites hitting other previous launches of satellites that are already in orbit? Or are these things very carefully tracked for each and every satellite?
They are very carefully tracked, but there is still a risk. There's a lot of satellites and a lot of debris in space.
Mm-hmm.
Currently, in the U.S., this is regulated by the FCC. So when you try and apply for radio spectrum, you also have to prove to them you're not going to create debris. The standards are pretty loose, so you really just have to prove that you're not going to break up into a bunch of tiny pieces, and your satellite's life isn't going to be longer than 25 years, so it'll deorbit it'll start to go into the lower atmosphere and burn up before 25 years is up.
With small sats, I remember doing some reading on it. Isn't the life only like 18 months unless you have a thruster on it?
Depends on the orbit.
Okay, so can you choose, or is there like, I went like low Earth orbit, I went middle Earth orbit, like, so you can choose?
I mean, there's limitations because usually these smaller satellites like CubeSats, you're riding with some larger satellite that bought the rocket, and they dictate where that rocket goes.
Oh.
But there are coming up more opportunities for you to sort of have a little bit more say, because there's a lot of launch companies that are making progress on smaller launch vehicles where, your cost will be higher, but you may be able to rapidly put up a smaller satellite in whatever orbit you want. Like there's Virgin Orbit, which is the Virgin Group's satellite launch company. There's Rocket Lab, which is already operational. And there's quite a few others that are working towards operation.
Wow. And like, what has been like one of your biggest challenges as you've been developing the satellite and trying to start to get out there raising funding? Like, what's some of the biggest problems you've encountered so far?
So, like I said, we have a strong culture of trying to iterate as quickly as we can. And one of the obstacles we think about a lot is just the tools that are good but not quite good enough to get there. So you think about like the process that goes into designing a circuit board, for example. And there are a lot of complicated steps, a lot of just bookkeeping, things like that, keeping track of everything, making sure everything's wired up properly, routing everything on the circuit board. So one obstacle we felt a lot about is how do we get through that process faster. And just in general, like the time it takes to get from an idea to working hardware or assembled hardware that we can test has always been difficult. Obviously, the price of launch is really difficult. If we could put something up quickly and at low cost, then we could iterate with higher fidelity earlier because we could test in the space environment itself. So yeah, and like you mentioned, that's tied to raising money, but I think that's not so much of an obstacle right now. We're not really at the point where we're anywhere close to twiddling our thumbs, wishing we had money.
Right.
So there's a lot of work we can do.
And with such low cost, you have a pretty long runway.
Yeah, so, I guess you could say our biggest challenge is like our team is really small. So things are moving slower than we want, but we also feel pretty strongly about trying to do with our team what software companies are starting to do with full cycle development, where each team member is sort of versed in the entire technology stack. So
essentially like Lean?
So probably the best way to describe it is there's three design or development methodologies that I know of. There's waterfall development, where you lay out all the requirements of your system that you'd ever want, and then you pass that down to the people who come up with the system architecture, who pass it down to the people who come up with the subsystems, who pass it down to the engineers who design the hardware, who pass it down to the people who test it. So, you have a very parallel development process. Lean is where you do the same thing, but in serial. So the people who define those requirements only define the very minimal set of requirements, and then they pass it down through the whole stack, and then they can go back and iterate and add new requirements, new features, right?
Right.
The idea with full cycle is that you're doing Lean, but you have everyone on your team knows how to do each of those layers, each of those steps, and so they don't have to hand it down. They don't have to hand off to anyone. Different members of the team can develop different features in parallel.
That's really cool.
So that. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I didn't. Wasn't I was saying, but yeah, that's really cool. I haven't heard of that.
So that's how Netflix does it. They sort of pioneered the idea. It's called full cycle. And in their case, they pioneered it because they had a lot of cases where they have engineers sending something to deployment, and then there'd be an issue deploying it to their servers, and so it would go back to the engineers, who'd have to tell the deployment technicians how to fix it. So there's this really long process that slows down the iteration cycle. And if you have one person who knows how to design the circuit board, lay it out, get it manufactured, test it, who can also design the mechanical systems and get those manufactured, and in our case, the radar systems, then you're able to iterate a lot more quickly. And so that's what we're trying to do, but it also involves a lot of learning. So there's a lot of, my teammate was a manufacturing engineer, really, really great at cutting anything out of metal that you could imagine. And he has learned immense amounts of circuit development in the last several months.
I've
been learning
so cool.
Software and radar. So that slows us down, but my hope is that we'll have this higher exponential growth as we're able to iterate more quickly, as we develop a culture where we're doing this full cycle, where it doesn't impede iteration.
That's really cool. One last question. I should probably let you go. What's one of your highlights, your favorite moments of the whole co-founder space startup scene?
The space scene in general, or just my experience starting?
Your experience with the startup, with the company. What was a highlight or a hilarious experience you've had?
So, our science advisor has sort of been telling us that the satellites need to have this one feature that sort of forces them to be pretty big. And so he's been telling us that the antenna needs to be a certain size. So our solution to that was, we'll pack the entire, truck-sized satellite into the antenna. And so we've been talking to different people about how do we, will you launch something that's not a CubeSat for us, that's actually just a flat panel? Because then we get that large antenna, but then we don't have a ton of mass. And something that has been kind of a crazy moment for me the last, week or two, couple weeks, has been toying with all of the trade-offs and equations that govern the wind measurement system, and realizing that fundamental assumption may not be true, that we need that large antenna, and that we may be able to do this really small. So that's something that's really, it's really exciting doing something that's at the edge like this, because I'm really doing due diligence on that, trying to make sure, do simulations and modeling, make sure that I haven't done something ridiculous that leads me astray. But that's something really exciting, to be at the edge and figure out something that no one else realizes, that no one else has thought of. It would be really transformative.
Space is the final frontier, and you're right on the edge. That's just so cool, man. Well,
exciting work. Yeah.
I am so glad you'd be on here. Is there, so you have the website, is there any other place, social media, anything else you want to plug?
You can follow us at CareWeather on Twitter or Facebook or Instagram. We don't post a lot yet, but as we get moving forward, making more progress, we will.
Yeah, all right, I'll include a few links in the description. Also, a shout out to Nate for throwing together the YouTube video. Really appreciate that. Next, not this Saturday, but the Saturday after this one, we'll be interviewing a financial advisor for SpaceX. And it won't be about SpaceX stuff, but he's a complete and total space nerd. He runs the Astronomical Returns, which is this awesome blog. You should check it out. Anyways, super excited for that. You guys will definitely want to tune in. And I know I'm forgetting something. Yeah, just follow us. Thanks again for being on the show, Patrick. Really appreciate the work that you're doing, paving the way for a whole lot more amazing, fantastic breakthroughs and discoveries. Anyways, no matter where you guys are, whatever project you're working on, remember to keep things janky to the max.
Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Jaynky to the Max. If you like it, make sure to like the video and subscribe. And if you want to suggest more projects that we can feature, make sure to comment down below, or even better, join the Discord server in the description. We try to stream live every weekend on the server, so make sure to join and grab the podcast role if you want to be there and see it for yourself. Anyway, make sure to stay janky.